Well, what are we talking about with economic growth? We're talking about increase in GDP, gross domestic product, which is a number that indicates how much money is being spent in the economy. And it's a marker essentially for consumption. What are people spending money for? Well, they're spending money so they can consume stuff. And it's intuitively obvious that growth in consumption can't go on forever. In fact, the only thing that grows forever is the universe itself, assuming that the Big Bang happened 15 billion years ago and no countervailing process is in store. Think of it this way. Take a hamster, newborn hamster, very tiny, tiny little organism. That newborn hamster is going to grow very rapidly for the first few weeks of its life. In fact, it's going to double its body weight every week. Very rapid rate of growth. Now, what would happen if our proverbial hamster were to continue doubling its body weight every week for one whole year? 52 doublings. How big a hamster would we have? Guesses? Well, I'll tell you. It would be a 9 billion ton hamster at the end of 1 year. That's the magic of compound growth. Now, we've gotten used to the idea that economic growth is normal, inevitable, and it can go on forever. That's an absurdity because that implies ever-growing rates of consumption of resources on a finite planet. Okay, so that's fairly uncontroversial statement. What is controversial is, I think, to claim that we are seeing the end of growth now. And I'm going to explain why I think that's the case. First of all, a little background, why we have growth in the first place. It's largely because of energy. Without energy, nothing happens, and in most of our history as a species, we got energy indirectly from the sun, from green plants. We exerted energy into the environment by way of muscle power, either human muscles or animal muscles. And then all of that changed with the fossil-fueled industrial revolution, where we found energy sources that were far more concentrated, were cheaper than anything we'd ever had before. One way of gauging that is if you've ever had the experience of running out of gas in your car. And I'm going to use American metrics here, excuse me, or US metrics. Maybe you had the necessity then of pushing your car, let's say 10 feet off to the side of the road. Imagine pushing your car instead of 10 feet. Imagine pushing it 30 miles. How much effort would that take? Well, it would take 6 or 8 weeks of hard human labor, assuming you could even move the thing, and I'm assuming you don't have a big SUV or something. So we get that done for us with a single gallon of gas that costs, in California, where I live, less than $4. I think it's a bit more here. Think of that, 6 or 8 weeks of hard human labor for, let's say, even $5. You can't get labor that cheap anywhere, and that's why we have mechanized every process of production and transport we possibly could over the past 200 years. And that's given us enormous economic benefits. Now, look at the last 2,000 years, empires rising and falling, and yet barely showing a blip on this graph of GDP per capita. Well, while this was happening over the last 200 years, where we see all of that immense growth, we were also increasing the number of capitas, the number of human beings, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, from 1 billion in 1800 to just a little over 7 billion today. So multiply that per capita increase in wealth by the increase in population, and you have some idea of the enormous amount of wealth that's been created as a result of having cheap fossil fuels. One of the things we did with fossil fuels was to use them to make stuff, manufacturing, powered assembly lines. And that enabled us to make stuff in larger quantities and at faster rates than people could buy all of that stuff. The biggest economic problem of the early 20th century actually was overproduction. and many economists say that the Great Depression was at least partly a result of overproduction, market saturation. Well, we solved that problem with two strategies. One strategy was advertising, talking people into wanting more stuff than they otherwise wanted, convincing them that they weren't happy, they weren't adequate, unless they purchased more material goods. This, of course, is an ad for a 1910 Studebaker car. In 1910, a new car like this cost about $900. Doesn't sound like much to pay for a new car today, but in 1910 dollars, that was a lot of money. This was a luxury item that only the very wealthy could afford. But meanwhile, we had methods of making these things in such large quantities that theoretically everybody could have one. So how to make that happen? Well, you talk people into wanting them, and then you make it possible for them to go into debt to buy what they otherwise couldn't afford. Consumer credit was the other main strategy that we used to increase consumption by pushing consumption forward in time. Consume now, pay later. And it worked. After the Great Depression, after we had the problem of overproduction solved, and especially after World War II, consumption levels increase, debt increases. One other ingredient actually was required, though, and that had to do with the monetary system and the financial system. See, up to this time, money had been tied to precious metals, gold and silver, but there was only so much gold and silver in the world, and so that put a certain limit on the velocity of commerce, on how much could be borrowed and spent. So over the course of the 20th century, we reformed the financial industry, reformed the monetary system itself to de-link money from precious metals. So what is money then, if it's not gold and silver? Well, money is debt, and debt is money. It sounds kind of funny to say it that way, but that's quite literally and exactly true. If you go into a bank and take out a loan for, let's say, $10,000, the banker doesn't go into the bank vault and search around somewhere for $10,000 that somebody else left there. No, the banker goes to the computer, makes a few keystroke entries, and creates $10,000 out of nothing as a deposit in your account. And then when you pay back that $10,000, it disappears. It's magic. Okay, so that makes it much easier for the money supply to grow in response to consumer demand. But when the banker makes that $10,000 loan, she or he is not at the same moment creating the money that will have to be paid in interest on that loan. So where does that money come from? Well, it comes from other people elsewhere in the economy also taking out loans. You're doing business with them, you're working for them or selling them stuff. And as long as the total amount of debt is increasing all the time, then theoretically everybody will be able to pay back their debts with interest. The problem comes if the entire economy stops growing. Then there isn't enough new money being created to pay back the loans with interest, and people start defaulting on their loans. Banks pull back on lending. People start losing their jobs, and the economy starts feeding on itself and collapsing. And that's essentially what happened. It happened in the Great Depression in the 1930s, and it happened again in 2008. Now, up until the 1980s, this was all ticking along fairly well. The real economy of goods and services, measured by GDP, was growing at a rather rapid rate, and the money supply was growing at approximately the same rate. Starting in the 1980s, debt grows faster than GDP. How so? Well, globalization starts in the 1980s. So increasingly, people, let's say high-wage workers in North America, are finding themselves in competition with lower-wage workers elsewhere on the planet. So this puts downward pressure on wages, but people still want to consume more. They're still being advertised at many hours every day. And we want them to consume more in order to grow the economy. 70% of the economy is consumer spending. So how to make that happen? By increasing debt, by making it easier for people to take on more debt.